Rose grabbed her husband's wrist and said three words that would either destroy their marriage forever or save it. After 27 years together, she was done. The suitcase wasn't just packed. It was sitting by the front door like a threat. The divorce papers weren't just drafted. They were signed and ready for delivery. One foot was already out the door, the other desperately searching for a reason to stay. But then she remembered something her grandmother once told her about mirrors and truth, something that sounded like old wives' folklore until the moment it became the most dangerous experiment of her life. What happened next defied everything marriage counselors teach. It wasn't communication techniques. It wasn't date nights or couples retreats. It wasn't learning each other's love languages or finding compromise. It was something far more dangerous and far more powerful. It was the kind of truth that could either shatter everything they built together or reveal what had been hiding underneath the rubble of 27 years of accumulated resentment. Before I tell you what those three words were, words that would be whispered between them like a secret code for the rest of their lives, you need to understand why this moment changed everything, not just for Rose, but for how we think about love, marriage, and the lies we tell ourselves about the people closest to us. Rose Martinez was 41 years old, living in a cramped two-bedroom house outside Phoenix, married to a man she'd stopped recognizing years ago. David worked construction 10-hour days under the Arizona sun, calloused hands, aching back, and a paycheck that barely covered the bills. The morning everything changed started like 100 others before it. David's alarm failed to go off. He stumbled into the kitchen 20 minutes late, grabbed yesterday's cold coffee, and muttered something about traffic. Rose, already dressed and ready, watched him rush around like a man perpetually behind schedule. The groceries, she said, holding up the list they'd discussed 3 times that week. David paused at the door, keys jangling in his hand, that familiar look of a man who'd forgotten something important crossing his face. Right, the groceries. I'll grab them after work. You said that yesterday and the day before. We've been eating cereal for dinner because you keep forgetting. Rose, I'm already late. You're always late. You're late for work, late for dinner, late for everything that matters in this house. And there it was, the same toxic dance they'd perfected over decades. David's jaw tightened. Rose's voice rose, the kitchen filled with that familiar electricity that meant another day would begin with warfare. Maybe if you reminded me nicely instead of attacking me the second I walk in the door. Maybe if you acted like an adult instead of a teenager who needs his mother to remind him of basic responsibilities. David's face went red. Rose's hands started shaking. They stood on opposite sides of their small kitchen like gunfighters at dawn. 27 years of marriage reduced to who could land the more devastating blow. But this time something different happened. Rose caught herself mid-sentence, finger pointed at David like a weapon, and saw her reflection in the microwave door behind him. Her face was twisted with rage. Her mouth was open in mid-attack. Her eyes held the same bitter disappointment, the same righteous fury, the same exhausted contempt she'd seen in her own mother's eyes during her parents' screaming matches 30 years earlier. I look exactly like her, Rose whispered to herself, lowering her finger slowly. Oh my God, I've become everything I swore I'd never be. David, confused by her sudden silence, grabbed his lunch and left without another word. The door slammed, the house fell silent, and Rose stood alone in her kitchen, staring at the woman in the microwave reflection, a woman she barely recognized but somehow knew intimately. That's when her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as if Elena were standing right there in the room with her. Rose's grandmother, Elena Vasquez, had been a force of nature. Born in 1920, she'd survived the Great Depression by growing vegetables in desert soil, raised 6 children while working as a seamstress, and somehow maintained a marriage that neighbors whispered about with equal parts envy and disbelief. Elena and her husband Roberto had been married 53 years when Roberto passed away. At the funeral, people talked about their legendary love story, how they'd never been seen fighting in public, how Elena would light up when Roberto walked into a room even in their 70s, how they'd seemed to communicate in some secret language that only they understood. When Rose was 12, fascinated by her grandparents' relationship, she'd asked Elena point blank, "Abuela, what's the secret? How did you stay so happy together?" Elena had been kneading bread dough in her small kitchen, her weathered hands working the flour with practiced precision. She'd looked at Rose with those sharp brown eyes and said something that sounded like complete nonsense at the time. "Mija, the person you hate most in your spouse is usually the person you fear most in yourself. Your husband becomes your mirror, and most people spend their whole marriage fighting their own reflection." Rose had frowned, not understanding. "But what if he really is the problem?" Elena had laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a gentle breeze. "Oh, sweet girl, we're all the problem. The question is whether you're brave enough to see it." She'd explained that marriage wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone whose flaws would force you to face your own. The lazy husband who made you confront your own avoidance. The controlling wife who made you acknowledge your own need to dominate. The distant partner who reflected your own fear of intimacy. Your spouse doesn't create your anger, Mija. They just give you permission to feel what was already there. They become the safe place to put all the feelings you don't want to own. At 12, Rose had thought this was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. Adults were supposed to know better, weren't they? Marriage was supposed to be about love conquering all, not some psychological chess game where everyone was secretly fighting themselves. But Elena had continued, rolling the dough with steady, hypnotic movements. "The day I stopped trying to change Roberto and started changing myself, everything shifted. Not because he got better, because I stopped needing him to be different to make me happy." "How do you do that?" Rose had asked. Elena had smiled and shared a technique that sounded like folklore, until the moment it saved Rose's marriage. "When you're angry at someone you love, look in a mirror first, really look. See your own face twisted with judgment. See your own pain reflected back. Then ask yourself, what am I really fighting?" Standing in that bathroom 29 years later, Rose finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to teach her. Rose spent the rest of that morning staring at herself in various reflective surfaces throughout her house. The bathroom mirror, the black television screen, the chrome surface of the refrigerator. Each reflection showed her the same thing: a woman at war with her own image. She began to see patterns she'd been blind to for decades. Every quality she despised in David, his emotional withdrawal, his stubborn refusal to communicate, his way of shutting down during conflict, she possessed in different forms. When David withdrew, Rose attacked. When David went silent, Rose filled the silence with criticism. When David avoided difficult conversations, Rose forced them at the worst possible moments. They weren't opposites, locked in eternal conflict. They were two sides of the same damaged coin, taking turns reflecting back the very wounds they were trying to heal. Rose realized she'd been making David responsible for feelings that belonged entirely to her. Her fear of being insignificant, her terror of being unloved, her deep-seated belief that she had to fight for every scrap of attention or respect she received. When David forgot the groceries, Rose didn't just see absent-mindedness. She saw evidence that she didn't matter. When David came home tired, Rose didn't see a hard-working man who needed rest. She saw someone who was too exhausted to love her properly. When David watched television instead of talking, Rose didn't see someone decompressing from a difficult day. She saw someone choosing entertainment over intimacy with her. But here's what hit her like a physical blow. she'd been doing the same thing to him. When Rose criticized David's forgetfulness, she was avoiding her own scattered attention to things that mattered to him. When Rose attacked David's emotional unavailability, she was deflecting from her own inability to be vulnerable without anger as her shield. When Rose complained about David's lack of communication, she was ignoring the fact that most of her communication was actually criticism disguised as concern. They'd created a perfect system of mutual projection, each making the other responsible for the very qualities they couldn't stand in themselves. Elena's words echoed in Rose's mind. We're all the problem. The question is whether you're brave enough to see it. Rose was about to find out just how brave she really was. That evening, David came home carrying 2 bags of groceries and wearing the expression of a man who expected to be attacked for something. He set the bags on the counter carefully, like someone defusing a bomb, and waited for Rose's response. Rose had spent 6 hours preparing for this moment, not preparing a speech or planning an argument, preparing to do the most terrifying thing she'd ever attempted in their marriage. She was preparing to tell the truth about herself instead of building a case against him. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ear. Every instinct screamed at her to point out that he was 3 hours later than he'd promised, to mention that half the items on the list were missing, to start the familiar dance of accusation and defense that had defined their relationship for over 2 decades. Instead, she walked over to where David stood braced for battle and said the 3 words that would change everything. I am terrified. David blinked, confusion replacing defensiveness. This wasn't how their evening fights usually started. There was no accusation in Rose's voice, no edge of attack, just raw, vulnerable honesty. I'm terrified that I've become my mother, Rose continued, her voice shaking with the effort of not deflecting into anger. I'm terrified that I've spent 27 years blaming you for problems that live inside me. I'm terrified that every time I criticize you, I'm really fighting parts of myself I don't want to admit exist. The kitchen went silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside their window. David's defensive posture began to melt, replaced by something Rose hadn't seen in his eyes for years, genuine curiosity about the person he'd married. I'm terrified that my need to be right has been more important than my need to love you, Rose whispered, and I'm terrified that if I keep fighting my own reflection in your face, I'm going to lose the only person who's ever been willing to put up with all my broken pieces. For the first time in their marriage, Rose wasn't trying to win an argument. She wasn't trying to prove David was wrong, or make him feel guilty or manipulate him into changing his behavior. She was simply telling the truth about her own experience, her own fears, her own contribution to the daily warfare they called marriage. David stood there for a long moment, groceries forgotten, staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time in decades. Then he did something that shocked them both. He started to cry. I'm scared too, David said, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'm scared I'm turning into my father, always working, never present, angry about things I can't even name. Coming home every day feeling like a failure because nothing I do is ever enough. Rose felt something shift in her chest, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. For the first time in years, she was seeing David not as her adversary, but as another human being carrying his own wounds, his own fears, his own desperate attempts to feel worthy of love. I withdraw because I don't know how to be what you need. David continued. I go silent because every time I open my mouth I seem to say the wrong thing. I forget things because my mind is always somewhere else, trying to figure out how to be a better husband, a better provider, a better man. They stood in their small kitchen, grocery bags wilting on the counter, seeing each other clearly for maybe the first time since their wedding day. Not as the fantasy versions of themselves they'd tried to maintain, but as flawed, frightened human beings who'd been using each other as repositories for everything they couldn't accept about themselves. Rose realized that every quality she'd attacked in David, his emotional distance, his forgetfulness, his retreat into work or television, were his versions of the same survival mechanism she used. She attacked when she felt threatened. He withdrew. She talked when she felt disconnected. He went silent. She demanded attention through criticism. He avoided attention through invisibility. They weren't incompatible personalities locked in eternal conflict. They were two people using different strategies to manage the same core fears. Am I lovable? Am I enough? Will you stay if you really see who I am? David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so vulnerable and human that Rose felt her own tears starting. I don't know how to stop disappointing you, he said quietly. You're not disappointing me, Rose replied, and for the first time in years, she meant it completely. I've been disappointing myself and making you responsible for fixing it. What happened next wasn't a Hollywood moment. There were no dramatic declarations or passionate embrace. David didn't sweep Rose into his arms. Rose didn't promise to never criticize again. Instead, they did something far more radical. They started having their first honest conversation in over 20 years. Over the following weeks, Rose and David developed what they privately called their mirror moments. But these weren't some new age ritual involving actual mirrors or crystals or meditation cushions. They were brutally honest reality checks that required more courage than either of them had known they possessed. The technique was deceptively simple. When conflict arose, instead of immediately defending their position or attacking their partner's behavior, they would pause and ask themselves one question: what am I seeing in you that I don't want to see in myself? The first few attempts were disastrous. Old patterns don't die easily, and Rose and David had decades of practice in their toxic dance. Rose would catch herself mid-criticism and try to redirect, but it came out stilted and artificial. David would attempt vulnerability but retreat the moment he felt exposed. They stumbled through conversations like teenagers learning a new language. But gradually something began to shift. Rose discovered that her accusations were like treasure maps leading directly to her own insecurity. When she called David emotionally distant, she had to confront her own emotional guardedness, the way she used anger as a shield to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of simply asking for what she needed. When she criticized David's work obsession, she faced her own obsession with being right, with winning arguments, with maintaining control through moral superiority. David learned that his complaints about Rose's controlling nature reflected his own need to control through withdrawal and passive resistance. When he accused Rose of never being satisfied, he had to acknowledge his own dissatisfaction with himself, his own belief that he was fundamentally inadequate as a husband and provider. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks into their experiment. Rose had started to criticize David for leaving dishes in the sink, caught herself, paused, and asked the mirror question. What she discovered shocked her. She wasn't really angry about dishes. She was angry that she felt invisible in her own home, that her efforts to maintain their shared space seemed to go unnoticed and unappreciated. Instead of attacking David's cleanliness habits, Rose said, I'm feeling invisible right now. When I see dishes in the sink after I've spent time cleaning the kitchen, I make up a story that my efforts don't matter to you. Can you help me understand what's really happening? David, instead of getting defensive, paused and applied his own mirror question. His immediate impulse was to justify leaving the dishes, to explain about being tired, to make Rose's feelings her problem. But when he asked what he was seeing in Rose that he didn't want to see in himself, he realized something profound. Her need to feel valued wasn't different from his own need to feel appreciated for working long hours to support their family. You're right, David said, and meant, I do the same thing at work when my efforts go unnoticed. I feel like they don't matter. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that leaving dishes was like me coming home to a paycheck that never acknowledged my contributions. This wasn't about dishes anymore. It was about two people recognizing their shared humanity beneath their different ways of expressing the same fundamental needs. 6 months later, Rose and David's friends started asking uncomfortable questions. The couple that everyone had quietly expected to divorce, the couple whose fights had become legendary at neighborhood barbecues, was suddenly different, not perfect, still fully human, still occasionally snappy with each other, still dealing with the practical stresses of bills and work, and a house that needed repairs they couldn't afford, but no longer at war. Mary, their next-door neighbor, cornered Rose at the mailbox one afternoon. "Okay, what's going on with you two? Did you start marriage counseling? Are you on some new medication?" David actually smiled and waved at me yesterday instead of just nodding and rushing inside. Rose laughed, realizing that their transformation had been visible to others before they'd fully recognized it themselves. "We started seeing ourselves instead of each other as the problem," she said simply. Mary looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means I stopped needing David to be different, because I stopped running from parts of myself, and he stopped defending against my criticism, because I stopped criticizing from a place of self-denial." The changes had been gradual but profound. Their fights became shorter, cleaner conversations about actual problems, rather than character assassinations designed to avoid personal responsibility. David started coming home and actually talking about his day instead of disappearing into television. Rose started expressing appreciation for David's efforts, and instead of only noticing his failures. More surprisingly, they each began to appreciate qualities in their partner that had previously driven them crazy. David's tendency toward quiet reflection, which Rose had labeled emotional unavailability, became something she valued as groundedness. Rose's attention to detail, which David had experienced as controlling, became something he appreciated as care for their shared life. They weren't different people, they were the same people choosing to see themselves and each other more honestly. Rose later told me, "We didn't fall in love again, we fell in truth." And truth, it turns out, is a much stronger foundation than the fantasy we'd been trying to maintain for 27 years. Now, if you're finding value in this story and want to explore more insights about relationships and human psychology that most people never talk about, the real messy, transformative truths that can actually change your life, I'd love for you to subscribe. I promise to keep bringing you stories and insights that go beneath the surface of what it means to be human. Here's what Rose and David discovered that marriage counselors rarely teach, that self-help books skip over, that romantic comedies never mention. The person who drives you crazy isn't your opposite. They're your mirror, showing you exactly what you can't stand about yourself. The lazy partner might be reflecting your own relationship with rest, productivity, and self-worth. The controlling partner might be showing you your own fears about powerlessness and chaos. The distant partner might be mirroring your own terror of true intimacy, of being fully known and potentially rejected. We don't attract our opposites despite what popular psychology teaches. We attract our teachers, people who will force us to face the parts of ourselves we've spent a lifetime avoiding, denying, or projecting onto others. Rose's grandmother, Elena, was right. The person you hate most in your spouse is usually the person you fear most in yourself. But here's the twist Elena never mentioned, the part Rose had to discover on her own. Once you stop hating that reflection, once you stop needing your partner to carry your disowned qualities, you also stop needing them to be anything other than who they are. And that's when real love becomes possible. Not the desperate, needy love of two people trying to complete each other or fix each other or become worthy through each other, but the generous, spacious love of two whole people who choose to share their lives without demanding that the other person be responsible for their happiness. Rose and David's marriage was saved not because they learned to communicate better or compromise more effectively, but because they learned to stop fighting their own reflections in each other's faces. The mirror doesn't lie. It just shows you what's already there, the beautiful and the broken, the generous and the selfish, the loving and the fearful, all of it. Every contradictory, complex, utterly human piece. The question isn't whether you'll see your reflection in your relationships. You will. The question is whether you'll have the courage to stop fighting what you see, and start embracing it as the first step toward real transformation. Because the moment you stop making your partner responsible for your happiness, your sense of worth, your emotional well-being, you become free to actually love them, not as a solution to your problems, but as a fellow traveler on the messy, beautiful journey of being human. Rose kept her grandmother's picture on the kitchen windowsill for the rest of her life, and sometimes when she caught her reflection in that window she would whisper, "Gracias, abuela, you were right, we were all the problem, and that was exactly the solution we needed."